I know what you're thinking. And yes, it really is that cold in my house. Quite often on an evening, I will light the fire in the sitting room, but I've opted not to light it this evening. So I'm sat in my kitchen and I am still wearing my coat and I'm still but yes, in fact, I just filled up my water bottle as well. I usually stick that down my jumper. That's why I find it hard to store my dried flowers in my house, and I store them with my parents. Because although I've got a few dried flower bits around in the kitchen is the only room that sort of stays um, not damp. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about what I think are some of the best cut flowers to grow. If you're new to growing cut flowers, or maybe even new to gardening altogether, these are all things that I grew in the beginning. I don't grow all of them now, although some of them I still grow a few of. But anyway, let's go on with the video.
Recently, I created a video which listed my top 10 cut flowers to grow. The video got me thinking about how my top 10 flowers have changed over the years. Some of the flowers that I happily grow now may have been a little more challenging for me to grow at the beginning of my cut flower journey. When I initially decided I wanted to grow cut flowers, I watched all of the YouTube suggestions for cut flowers for beginners or cut flowers that beginners should grow, anything in that sort of search category. And I remember I decided I just had to grow everybody's top 10 cut flowers because if seasoned growers and professional flower farmers were suggesting them, then they must be the right flower for me to grow. I took absolutely no notice of what zone, what soil, or even which country the recommendations were for. With that in mind, the flowers that I'm suggesting are flowers that I have grown in the UK in zone 8B and on clay. And I'm only going to suggest things to you that I could grow easily when I first started growing cut flowers and not the things that I grow now and are possibly a little bit more complicated to grow or harvest.
So I got the idea for this particular cut flower from, I bought a cut flower seed collection in the UK from a lady called Sarah Raven, who has a gardening company. And she suggested that I grew Amaranthus Red Army. So in my first year growing cut flowers, I grew this Amaranthus. It's a half hardy annual and it is pretty fail safe for beginners. I think the only thing that I perhaps did wrong in the beginning was I spaced it too far apart. And then the stems on it can get a little bit too chunky for bouquet work. So it's one of those things where actually, a bit like Snapdragons and Larkspur, you can actually plant them pretty close together. So in the beginning, I grew Red Army, and then I then went on to grow in future years. Like this year, I'm growing hot biscuits, and I've also grown Ushberg before. But I've got to say, actually, Red Army, credit where credit's due, it probably is still my favourite. Although I don't think my very old seed, because I've been trying to germinate the same seed that I originally got in the first year I grew cut flowers, but I don't think it's going to germinate. But last year, some of it self-seeded in the cut flower patch. So anyway, the reason I like the amaranthus, not only can you have it in sort of spires, so upright, like hot biscuits and Ushberg, but in fact, I think in my first year I did also grow the hanging one, just the green, because that was in the Sarah Raven cut flowers seed collection as well. I think that's probably better for event work and arranging in vases and urns and things like that. For me, where I predominantly concentrate on retail, the upright spikes are more useful. Although, having said that, I've got a wedding right at the very end of September this year, and I'm going to grow the trailing green one again, but I'm not going to be sowing that for some time because, well, I just don't need it for my retail bouquets. I don't need it right till the end of the season. So anyway, yes, amaranthus. It's a half hardy annual. So you don't want to sow it too early, but then it's really easy. And as I say, it's self-seed, so it's you can't really go wrong. Good soil and a rake. Okay, the next one is Florist's dill. And the reason this didn't go in my top 10 cut flowers is really only because it only comes in yellow. It's not varied enough for me. But I really quite like the scent. It sort of reminds me of cooking fish dishes a bit. But I love the scent, and because it's an umbellifer, it's a really good filler, and I find it complements really very well with dahlias. Again, it's really easy to start from seed. I've already started mine in the greenhouse this year. I didn't use any heat to start it. I just started it in an unheated propagator in my greenhouse, and it was really old seed. Again, it was seed. This wasn't in the Sarah Raven cut flower collection, but it was seed from the first year I grew, and I sowed that seed. I mean, it's really old seed, and the germination is absolutely fantastic. It's really versatile. I really like it. So that's why dill, I feel, is a good flower if you're just starting out. And then cosmos. Now, the reason I say cosmos is because cosmos was actually probably one of the first flowers I ever grew from seed ever. This was before I'd ever thought about growing cut flowers. This was when I was growing on my patio garden, and I was growing in containers. And I was growing these seeds in individual pots, and I was starting them off on the top shelf in my bathroom. And they're just so incredibly easy. And I love the fact they have that ferny foliage, which, if you're just doing your first year growing, you should know that you can actually just use the foliage. You can even use the foliage before the cosmos has flowered in your bouquets. And it's that really nice airy foliage to it. The reason it didn't make it into my top 10 flowers is mainly because I don't think, for me, for retail, the vase life is quite long enough, but for home arranging and for events, you really can't beat it. And there are some really trendy colours. I mean, there's so many colours that I still haven't tried that I'd like to try, but because I have limited space in the garden, I just don't have room to try them all. Try a different one every year. I think then when I did go on to grow cut flowers in my first year, I did grow cosmos because it was in my Sarah Raven half hardy cut flower collection. She probably still does them online. And she had one called Purity. But actually, I don't rate the Purity or the sort of the singles. I grew a double last year called Snow Puff, which is white. Purity is also white. I don't see why you grow Purity. Yes, I think Sarah Raven grows it because it's really quite prolific and you can get loads and loads of cuts off it. But for me, Snow Puff is just much prettier, and it's got a longer vase life. This year I'm going to be growing Snow Puff and Apricotta, just because that's the seed I've got left over from last year. It hasn't had hugely great germination, but again, because cosmos isn't really for my retail bouquets, I don't need a huge amount of it. So the few plants I've got will be absolutely fine. But if you're new to growing cut flowers and you want something easy, cosmos is for you. And like I say, there's a huge range of colours. Just make sure when you're buying your cosmos for cut flowers, just check the heights of the stems, because a few of the varieties are just a little bit short. I remember once buying one called Sweet Dreams. I loved the look of the flower, but when I grew it, it was just quite difficult to get long enough stems on it. This one's going to surprise some of you because I've been digging up plants in my cut flower patch because I don't think I love them enough to be in the cut flower garden. And one of them is Dunes. I grew in my first year from seed a red one, Blazing Sunset, and a yellow one, Lady Stratton. And yeah, they're not my favourite now, but in my first year, they were great because I grew them from seed. They're perennial that flowered in the first year. And they were brilliant. So I would definitely recommend them if you're starting out. I mean, I still love them now. It's just that I have to be really overcritical about what I grow. But I think if you're in your first year or you're thinking about starting, then June are definitely one that's really straightforward. It's a perennial that you can divide in a few years' time, and you'll find it really useful. And another one that surprisingly didn't make it into my top 10, and this was probably a bit of a shocker, was Snapdragons. And the reason they didn't make it into my top 10 is mainly because for me, there are other spires which I could dry. So it was a process of elimination. It's not that I don't like Snapdragons. I grew them my first year and loved them. Again, they were in my Sarah Raven cut flower collection, half hardy annuals. Oh, I wish I could remember what the variety was. But in her collection, she had, it was quite um, a red snapdragon. But I also grew some that I just bought from the garden centre, which was a rust resistant variety, which actually, interestingly, I grew the same variety last year, the rust resistant. The seed was really old. And wasn't I pleased I did? Because last year the drought meant that my other varieties of Snapdragon got really bad rust and the rust resistant didn't. So I'm going to recommend to you, if you haven't grown Snapdragons before, that perhaps buy the rust resistant variety, just because I've got a feeling we're going to have another drought year this year. In my first year, I cheated somewhat, I suppose, because I was new to growing, and Snapdragon seed is so tiny. So I actually bought pelleted seed. I think they do it a lot for Lysianthus because that seed's really small as well. And they do like a pellet that's bright yellow. It's much easier to handle and you can see where you're sowing it. I find that Snapdragons, for me, I do need a bit of heat to start them. But having said that, they will self-seed. So probably if I started them a bit later in the season in the greenhouse, they would be fine. But Snapdragons are really quite slow. So my advice to you probably would be autumn sowing is best, and then keep them frost-free until the spring. But if you are going to sow them in the spring and you can find somewhere warm, you want to get on with them just because they're a bit slower. They do need light to germinate. So that's something I can't do in the airing cupboard. When I do a lot of early seeds, I do a lot in the airing cupboard, but Snapdragon's not one that will like that. There is an absolute array of different varieties of Snapdragons. And it's my understanding, although I should probably do more research on this, but I think they all flower at, slightly different times of the year. But I've got to say, my favourite's just Chantilly. I just love it. I just love the Chantilly. They're not as, the flowers aren't as close together as they are on the Madame Butterfly and Pomatic, things like that. For me, it's like, if you've got a dog, I mean, if you haven't got a dog, you won't get this, but there's a breed that's your favourite breed and you stick to it. For me, that's what it's like with Snapdragons. I am growing some, it's April, no, not apricots, that's the cosmos. I'm growing a really popular, apple blossom. Yeah, I'm growing a really popular Snapdragon this year, apple blossom, but I bet I don't use it as much as my Chantilly. If I don't use it as much next year, tell me in the comments not to grow it. Just say just grow Chantilly. But anyway, I certainly would recommend the rust resistant to you if you're just starting out, and potentially if you can find pelleted seed, it might be a bit easier. And I'm going to throw a biennial into the mix here. So it's a bit late if you're sowing now for your season. But if you get hold of the seed for Dianthus barbatus, biennial Sweet William, then if you sow it in May or June, which, God, do you know what? May or June will be here before we know it. I don't want to wish the spring away, but I want to wish the rain away. But anyway, if you sow it in the spring, then it will flower for you following year. And it's in my first year when I decided, because I'd been growing cut flowers just for myself to play with, and then I randomly decided I was going to go to this market. And oh my God, I look back at my flowers and I'm so embarrassed about what I took to the market. But I had some really good Sweet William actually. I grew just a mix of colours. I'm trying to think, I don't think that was in my cut flower collection. I just decided to grow them. But they're good because you sow them the year before, they're a little bit earlier, and sometimes you can have a bit of a hole with your cut flowers if you haven't got something a bit earlier. It's a really good filler, and you can actually plant that out in the autumn. So sow it in May, June time, plant it out September, October, and it will overwinter outside fine. And then that just gives you a little bit of a head start next year. But definitely one I recommend for you. The next one I have such a serious love-hate relationship with. But I've got to say, when I was first growing, it was so incredibly useful. And I'm not sowing any this year for the first time ever, but I'm sort of hoping that I get a few bits self-seeded. If it doesn't self-seed anywhere, I might really, really miss it, because I remember saying one year, I can't remember what year it was, how I wasn't going to use it, and I used it loads. Because when I went out into the garden, I always use, when I make a bouquet, I use what looks best in the garden that day, and it just was always looking great. And it's calendula. Um, yes, the stems can be a bit sticky and it can turn the water a bit murky, but some of the colours you can get now are just brilliant. And mine, where they self-seed, is where I've got almost like really hybridized, like my own varieties. I will pop in some pictures of bouquets because I've probably used it in multitude of bouquets. I really wonder if not sowing any this year is a mistake, but I really can't now because I've already sown way more than I've got room for. And we're going to talk about that next week. We're going to go into why I've sown so many seeds, and I'll explain why, and it'll all become clear. Anyway, calendula. And then I never know how to say this one. Somebody mentioned it in the comments once before, so I might ask Alexa how to say it and come back to you. Okay, well, I'm none the wiser on the pronunciation. But I'm going to throw Clary sage, salvia. I always say viridi, but I'm pretty sure that's wrong because someone told me it was wrong. So I'll write it on the screen. And this was another one. This is actually Hardy Annual. So this was in the Sarah Raven Hardy seed collection, which I got in my first year. And she actually had the mixed colours. I don't like the mixed colours anymore. For me, I always find the white ends up going to brown. So my recommendation is to you is to either buy sort of a pink and blue separately or pick pink or blue. Last year I grew denim blue. I think there are various shades of blue. And although it's not a huge flower, so it's not going to make your bouquets bigger or anything like that, it's one of those details, and you do sort of need detail. I used it a lot for the wedding I did last year, in beginning of July. I'm not growing it this year again. This is why this video is a bit different, because these are things that I definitely loved growing in the beginning because they were easy and they gave me what I wanted. And I'm not saying I'll never grow it again. I'm saying I want to try some different things this year. So I've had to ditch a few things, but I recommend it definitely as something for a beginner. And it does dry as well. I didn't dry huge amounts of it, but I did dry a bit of it. But anyway, I recommend hello. I recommend that as well. Okay, we're getting there, just two left. Okay, so the next one I'm going to suggest is poppies. And no, I do not mean Icelandic poppies, or Calvary poppies, or any of those fussy things to grow. They're great for event work, but they're not. I don't think they're what you want for growing in your home garden. I think if you do want to do this professionally, then I think they're great. But I'm talking about your bulk standard opium poppies, and no, not for the flowers, because obviously the flowers will last about a day, but I'm talking about growing them for their seed heads. love that sage green. It just goes with everything. And if you don't use them all fresh, you can dry them. I don't know if I've got, oh, I haven't. But I thought I might have a poppy seed head in this, but it's a Nigella. But yes, poppies. I don't always sow them, but luckily when I sort of pick them up, if you shake them a bit, they do sort of end up growing everywhere. And it's a bit like Greek cress. If you are going to sow them, you want to succession sow them to keep it so you've got them nice and green going through the year. So I did sow a few outside direct sow a couple of days ago, but then somebody who's, I mustn't complain too much because they're helping me with my polytunnel, walked all over the bed and said they didn't know it was a bed, even though it clearly had a label. It'd been raked to a fine tilth. It is a flower, but you've seen my beds. You know what the beds are. You know where the paths are. And I mean, I'd only sown them that morning. I walked out in the afternoon and just completely compacted and stood my whole bed in. So I raked it again and threw a few more seeds in. But if they don't germinate, we're blaming the polytunnel helper. There was actually quite a serious argument about this, and he upped towards the bed. But you know, do you feel someone walked all over the beds? Anyway, joking apart, it's okay. He's coming back. We've got over it. So anyway, opium poppies, and then drum roll. Last but not least, and I'm growing them again this year. Didn't grow them last year, but in my first year I grew loads of them, and that is sunflowers. Really easy, guys. They like darkness to germinate, so make sure you push them nice and deep down in the compost or cover them. And oh my god, don't just sow like 20 in one go. Sow them in 5, then like 7 days later another 5, then 7 days later another 5, because you just want to stagger them a bit, especially if you're going to grow the sunflowers like the pro cuts, just one flower per stem. Do you know what? I prefer growing the branching varieties, and the ones I'm going to recommend to you. One of them was in the Sarah Raven cut flower seed collection, and that was vanilla ice. So it's really pale yellow with a black center. But then my absolute favorite was Ruby Eclipse. And I'm not growing it this year. I love the color, love, love, love the color. And when I first started making bouquets, I could work with it fine. So I didn't really know what I was doing. But now I just find them too flat facing. And this year I'm trying one that's supposed to have an upward facing sunflower, which you could try that one too if you want. It's called Orange Up, but I haven't grown it before. But I think in your first year, they're just so incredibly easy. The majority of the flowers I've suggested for you, with the exception of the June, are annuals. Cut and come again, cut and come again. Don't think that with all annuals. If you've got something like a stock, unless you can get hold of the special branching stocks, I think Rainbow Quartet is one of them. A stock is you chop the flower off and then that's it, it's done. But the idea with growing annuals for cut flowers is that they know they're only going to grow for that year. So they have to put so much energy into producing flowers. And if you keep cutting their flowers off, they will keep producing flowers because they need to seed to, spread their generation onto the next year. So the more you cut the flowers off, the more they go, oh no, I need more flowers because I need to make seed. Perennials are a bit lazier. They will cut and come again, but they sort of know it's all right if I don't seed this year, I'll seed next year. So that's why, although perennials people say are less labour intensive, and certainly in terms of not having to re-sow every year, I agree with that. But you know what? When they're established, you have to divide them, keep the beds weed free and mulched. There are two schools of thoughts on that. I mean, I love my perennial beds for different reasons, not really because I think they're any easier. For me, they tend to flower It's times of year where maybe the annuals haven't got going. They can either be the May, June gap, or things like your asters can start, perennial asters, I mean, by the way, can start flowering at the end of the season when perhaps other things are finished. So for first time cut flower growing, you cannot go wrong with hardy or half hardy annuals. Hardy annuals are the ones which a lot of them you can autumn sow. They still won't like it if they get frosted. So you can autumn sow them. You want to take care of them over the winter. And then if you have managed to get things through the winter, you'll get earlier flowers in the spring. One year I was so successful at autumn sowing, but every year since then the voles eat everything. But I do have a concrete floor and a greenhouse now, so maybe if I sow some things in September, maybe I'll get them through this time. I don't think if I put anything in the polytunnel, I think the voles would eat it. Anyway, look how I get off subject. We're on to voles now. Anyway, the basic thing is, if you're one of these people who dreams of growing cut flowers, and you're like me, you've read all the books from cover to cover, you've subscribed and followed all the videos on YouTube about growing cut flowers, you may have even, like me, this is what I did in the beginning as well, I paid for quite a few courses that I went on, even did the business module of actual sort of floristry in the UK. And you can spend hours of your time researching and just thinking about it, but the only way you will find out if you like it is to sow some seed. And you don't need a huge space. I mean, when I used to grow on my patio, in my little courtyard garden, it's amazing what you can grow in a few containers, but you won't know until you give it a go. So why don't you, are you one of those people who puts a whole lot of seed in your shopping basket and never checks it out? Go and check those seeds out. And then when they arrive, get seed sowing. Let me know what you're growing. If you've grown anything that I've mentioned before and you hate it or you like it.
So I'm just editing this video, and all the last clips I did, there's no sound. So I'm just quickly, I was very nearly at the end of the video. But basically, go and sow some seed. It's bank holiday weekend this weekend, so perhaps sow some seed then. If this video goes out before then, which it probably won't. If you like the video, don't forget to give it a like. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do so. I'd love you to come with me on my growing journey and see why I have sown ridiculous amount of seed this year, but all will become clear probably next week. And if you would like to contribute towards my channel, you can always buy me a coffee, and the link for that is in the description for this video. And you may not want to because the quality of this video has been pretty rubbish, but I promise I'm trying. Okay, see you next time, guys. Bye.
For my log, it's 2020 and it's the end of June.